We are joined by Mark Kerrigan, the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Revenue Officer for PAS. He leads the technology and operations and sales organizations. He's had a variety of positions, including Senior Vice President of Technology, Managing Director, Middle East, and Global Sales Leader. Been in the industry for a number of years, mechanical engineer from University of Michigan. I'm unfortunate, I'm a Notre Dame man myself, so I apologize. But looking through this presentation, there's a lot of discussions in here around our current world, kind of current state with COVID, and I think it's going to be of great interest to everybody to kind of look at some of these new emerging risks in this space. So with that, Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate it. Well, again, thank you, everyone, for the opportunity today. I'm going to spend a little time today on, basically the idea of remote operations in the industrial world, sort of the past, how we got here, what's happening today, and the trends that we see for the future. We'll go through a few case studies and lessons learned and next steps. I will be talking not only from a security perspective, but also from an operational perspective in this area, the challenges that companies have today trying to conduct work remotely. So, how do we get here? Well, clearly companies have been trying to do more work remotely for a long time. It's been a long, very slow journey, and some industries have gotten farther along than others, and I'll give two examples of that. Certainly in the oil and gas industry, and especially in offshore production, a lot of investment has been done to try and facilitate remote work. Getting people to the platforms is expensive. The work on that platform is expensive, and it's hard to get enough people on there to do the work that you need to do. So ultimately, that industry has made some certain amount of strides, perhaps compared to others, prior to COVID-19, trying to enable more work to support offshore operations. Another example, the industrial gas business, people that produce like liquid nitrogen, liquid argon, et cetera. A lot of those facilities are relatively small, say compared to a large refinery or a petrochemical plant, and they're geographically dispersed. And just from a cost perspective, also the process tends to be a bit simpler than, say, a more complex, polyethylene process or things like that. And so a lot of effort has been done to try and automate as much as possible, and for some facilities to blacklight them. That is, they don't actually have feet on the ground all the time, and they can monitor those facilities remotely, show up for maintenance or other types of activities where they can for some of their smaller facilities, really driving out cost in that particular instance. So just two examples of industries that, prior to COVID-19 started to work on this and do more things remotely. Well, all of us got punched in the mouth by this thing called COVID-19, where remote work was no longer a nice to have, it was a must to have. And necessity is the mother of invention. And a lot of the things that the owner operators used to do by putting feet on the ground had to be done from the kitchen table. And overnight, had to start to do this. And so people had to scramble. They had to try and do different things to try and enable this so we can keep the lights running. And in some cases, security investments took a back seat. If I'm managing an asset, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, I'm just worried about keeping the facility running when I can't get people on site. That's my biggest risk to the enterprise, not a potential cyber risk. As a result, in many cases, certainly investments in security had to pause just because of trying to deal with this current situation. This slide is really from the desk of Captain Obvious. Has coronavirus impacted the portion of time people working from home compared to being there? And obviously the answer is yes. The overwhelming amount of people, more people are working from home as compared to not, and so people are having to adjust accordingly. So what are the challenges? How have we tried to deal with this, or what's been really hard to do this? Well, certainly control rooms have been more locked down. At many facilities, the control room or an office adjacent to the control room is really the place for collaboration, where a lot of people come together, they talk about the work for the day, they sign off on work orders, people come and go, and they had to change that. They're very worried that if I had an infection hit my operators in there, I would be in deep trouble. So they locked them down. Even if people are on site, they can't go to the control room. And so the way that we did work had to change. Certainly, travel was curtailed very heavily for a long time, where people might be traveling to support the business or bringing in vendors. That had to stop. Certainly, that's also relative to the vendors themselves. A lot of times, the work that was being done by vendors, a typical large facility has more contractors on site than actual employees, especially during a turnaround. But even during normal operations, they may have a lot of contractors on site doing their work. That got limited. Only the most critical work was being allowed on site. We're trying to keep the number of feet in the facility down. And so a lot of work that was going to, hopefully be done had to get paused, but eventually we got to get back to it. Certainly increased workplace sanitation, trying to keep things clean, and obviously a decrease in face-to-face interactions. Beginning of COVID, we actually saw a number of end owner operators actually enact, essentially here on the US Gulf Coast, their hurricane protocols, where basically people were locked in the facility, locked in and quarantined. Obviously, they couldn't do that in the long term, but they basically just locked people in, and you got to stay there until we can roll through as best as we can. And then staggered shifts, less feet on there, compensate for higher than normal absences, and just trying to keep less people on there. So perhaps the engineers and maintenance people, they're there half of the time, and then the other half are there the other half of the time, just trying to stagger it and minimize the boots on site. The other thing is that while we all hope for the day, and I certainly miss getting out and being on site and face-to-face meetings, believe me, quote, we're not going to go back to quote normal or whatever normal is. There are a number of companies that are seeing some peripheral benefits from doing more work remotely, certainly travel costs going down and other things. We'll talk about how to do that here shortly. But, and some companies have actually seen this as an acceleration of something they've been wanting to do for a long time. They've proven they can operate these facilities remotely or more remotely. As a result, we're not going to, quote, go back to normal. We're not going to be back in the same place where work was always done on site. And manufacturers believe that this is a permanent change coming. So we have to adapt. And certainly our role in security is to make sure that these things can be done securely while we continue to operate the facilities. And more on that again here shortly. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the before, during, and after COVID-19, kind of what the case was, and how we gave people access to the information to do their work. Well, I have this in three different buckets, and prior to COVID-19, I would say the one thing, and especially in the processing industries, oil and gas, power, et cetera, access to process data was very mature. A historian was pretty much ubiquitous that got information from control systems and got information like pressures and flows and temperatures and the process data. That was up in the DMZ and then made available up in the business network. And so being able to get into information about the process itself was mature. And so that was already there, and people did not lose access to that when they went remote. When COVID hit, one of the things that happened is people tried to create more remote access into the environment. Certainly from the IT side, that's a bit more of a mature standpoint, but when we're talking to control engineers, production engineers, in many cases, we increased the amount of remote access to allow people down into the OT environment, level 3 and below, level 2 and below in the Purdue model, through VPNs and jump boxes and remote sessions and all these types of things. Because, when this hit, I had to keep the lights on, I had to keep operating. And so we accelerated remote access by a lot of people. And really we're balancing those trade-offs. The trade-off between having, the right access to do the work, but limit it in such a way, whether it be session-based monitoring to increase security. And in some ways, we're going to have to figure out, and again, I'll talk about this here shortly, perhaps in the longer term, we're going to have to think about limiting boots on the ground, if you will, in the process control network that is remote. Because obviously, the more ports I have in and the more people I have going in, the more I'm opening up my ability for the wrong people to try and get in. I would say another area, the final column, areas where we certainly need to do improvement. If we truly are going to be doing work more remotely, And at the same time, I want to limit how many people are in the actual process control network itself at any given time, that a lot of information that only resides currently in the process control network has got to be lifted and put up into the DMZ and the business network so people can access that information without actually having to go to the control network itself. So things like cybersecurity posture, discovering devices on the network, new communication paths, vulnerabilities, changes to configuration. These are all things that we want to have access to without necessarily having to go to the actual process control network itself. But also we want information around the status of safety systems and other things about the current health of my safety within my environment. So things that typically people have to go to the site now today about, status of alarm systems, what safety systems are currently in bypass, how are we doing with operational limits, how are my control loops performing, for Mike's previous example. All this is information that engineers need just to run the plant. And the question is, can we get this information to them without actually having to give them remote access into the control network itself? Because obviously, with more people on the control network, the more either I can let the wrong person in, but also someone with very good intent could hit the wrong button, make the wrong change, and cause issues in production itself. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through a couple of remote work use cases. These are actually two examples, two different industries. This is actually, work that was taking place prior to COVID-19, but just some examples of how some people have tried to address this and deal with their own remote work challenges. The first one I'm going to go through is actually an oil and gas company in the Asia Pacific region. They do operate all over the world with facilities in multiple different companies, and a lot of their facilities are in fact offshore. The challenges they had is they were trying to do good, safe operations on a lot of older assets. A number of their offshore production facilities are old, they are aging, and so they had to make sure they continue to operate these older facilities safely. They have a limited availability of professional resources to be able to do this work, and trying to, if you will, staff all of these things independently just wasn't feasible. They're trying to obviously manage operational costs and make sure they can keep that within reason. And one of the big problems is a lot of the information they needed to do their job remotely was really hard to get. It was manual. You fill out spreadsheets. You try and send this information in. It might be wrong. The way one person collected it was different than another. Again, process data might be available, but everything else wasn't necessarily available automatically. And even if you wanted to automate it, you might have some limited communication bandwidth relative to, I may only have a microwave, for instance, connection between the offshore asset and onshore. So what they wanted to do, they took a step back and said, okay, we got to be able to get more information about the operational status of these platforms and make them available in a central engineering station. So they wanted to get critical operational information like status of safety systems and alarms and operational limits and other things up into their single center of excellence center located at their headquarters. They wanted to be able to do more strategic collaboration across the assets, look at the performance, compare them, making sure that we're establishing good work practices and being consistent. They had to have an agile environment where they could have different business requirements and shift as where things are required. And essentially, they're looking for a single source of truth to understand what is the status of these various systems, do good reporting, benchmark performance across the different assets so they can make good decisions to make sure they're operating these facilities safely. So the results they've had have been good. Certainly, they feel like that this has been a major improvement, and it's been a lot of things. It's been technology, it's been work process, it's been training. There's a lot of things that have gone into this very big strategic program. They're certainly reporting that they believe they're saving over $1 million a year per field in operational improvements. A big thing was they were able to reduce the number of safety systems in bypass by over 95%. This type of information, like various shutdown systems, et cetera, things do have to get bypassed from time to time for maintenance purposes and everything else, but they just didn't have good visibility. They didn't know what was bypassed and when. Someone might open up a work order to bypass it and forget to close it out and reenact it. just by making this information available and having eyeballs on it, they were able to have a much better system to manage bypasses and make sure they were re-enabled quickly. They were able to do a lot of work to improve the alarm system performance to make sure operators didn't have a problem with alarm floods. Big thing was reducing time on reporting. I mentioned earlier, a lot of this information they were trying to get, it was incomplete, but very, very manual. Trying to get it, but the spreadsheet approach and the checklist approach just wasn't working. They saved a lot of money just trying to report this information. Able to improve loop performance by basically, again, eyeballs on performance, putting the right resources to fix it, because a lot of loops were manual because they just weren't working properly. And so by better understanding that, they could do more proactive maintenance and keep them running better. And then having all of this centralized enabled their desire to have a centralized support center to bring all of this together. So I'm going to go into another case, really more cyber related, and want to apologize because I realized 5 minutes before the presentation that this slide you see right here was an older version, and you'll see the challenges and requirements were the exact same as I just went through with this oil and gas. It's the wrong slide, and I apologize. So I'm going to actually walk you through what their challenges were. I'll just talk you through it, so please ignore the what you see written on this particular slide. This particular company is an electronic materials company that actually spawned out of an industrial gas company. It used to be part of an industrial gas company, but they make specialty chemicals for making, electronics. A lot of those chemicals, by the way, to make, chips and everything else, very, very toxic chemicals. You use specialty chemicals to burn boards and everything else, and very, very sterile environments that make an operating room look like a dump. It has to be that clean to do that type of work, and they use very hazardous chemicals to do that. These are again, globally dispersed sites to make these chemicals that are, again, relatively small. And they can't necessarily have a very large staff out there to do security on these relatively small, geographically dispersed facilities. So they had a very difficult time trying to establish a program across all these facilities. The other thing, common for all owner operators, a lot of different assets and asset types that existed out there. Many different types of PLCs and safety systems and DCS systems from many different vendors. And they didn't have a good handle on what they had. They didn't have a good inventory. They didn't know what necessarily was out there. They had a spreadsheet-based approach, and they had to get a good handle on what they had to drive their OT security program. The next thing is they had defined a pretty good standard and set of policies for managing the configuration of their OT assets. Things like what services should be running depending upon the environment, what ports should be open, what is supposed to be my maximum age of any antivirus definition files, on and on and on. They had good policies, but no way to know what they are and to enforce it. They had to rely upon, here's your policy, tell me how you did, without any kind of centralized way to understand, are we doing good against these policies that we had? And finally, they recognized that they didn't necessarily have the ability to build out a very large, if you will, OT security team, and they had to implement a lot of processes to basically drive IT and OT collaboration. They realized they had to form up a team of what I call traditional IT security experts, people that really understand security, the threats, and the best ways to take out risk, and actually OT engineers, control engineers, people have actually, controlled program PLCs, have worked on a DCS, who've been responsible for production. Ultimately, it was a cross-functional team that was going to be required to actually go out and implement a program that reduced risk and improved security. So they went off, and again, it was very much a three-legged stool. It was about people, it was about process, and it was about technology to deal with this and to make significant improvements. So certainly one of the big things they were able to do is get a comprehensive, accurate, and continuous visibility into all of their assets, as well as vulnerabilities down to level 0, critical for their program. Certainly all of that helped them improve their cyber threat protection. They had a much better understanding of what was out there, what the status was, and have taken actions to reduce the threat profile. They also believe that they've reduced risk of production outages and safety incidents because they have a much better handle on the configuration of all the assets and what the changes are. I will say that a well-intentioned engineer making the wrong change in a control system has caused much, much more damage than, if you will, the bad guy from the outside. That's just the reality of these control systems. You can make changes with good intent that cause problems. That's still, if you will, more likely to cause you problems than a person from the outside coming in. But at the end of the day, you're still down. You still cause some equipment damage. You're still suffering economic impact. And also they feel that they put some things in place to support their digitalization transformation. By better securing the control systems and managing it better, they can start to get more data out to continue on their digitalization future. So what are the lessons learned and what are the next steps? So I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with the Purdue model and the basic architecture in place for most locations. Level 0 instrumentation, level 1 being the controllers, whether it be DCSs or PLCs, the HMI layer at level 2. I'm going to call really that OT for now. Level 2 down is what I'm going to call OT, or the control systems. Level 2 is really dominated by Windows boxes and some Linux and others, but ultimately, let's call that, for the sake of this conversation, OT. Well, if you remember my previous talk about the current state of COVID before, evolving and needs improvement, what really happened prior to COVID is, for the most part, we had good information to work remotely from level 3 up around process data, flows, temperatures, pressures. It's in the historian. We could get that information, and we felt very comfortable we could get access to that through remote sessions, VPNs, jump boxes, etc. Good information that was there. Well, when COVID happened, we got to keep the place running. I can't go to site anymore, but I still got to do maintenance on this. Operators calling me at 3 o'clock in the morning at home saying I'm still having problem, controlling reflux on this tower or whatever. So I got to do something. So what do? We enable remote access. What am I doing with remote access? I'm getting access to information that previously I could only get when I was on site, whether it be at level 2 or level 1. From a security standpoint, what devices are out there? What communication paths are taking place? What vulnerabilities are there? What's changed? From a safety standpoint, how are my safety systems? Anything in bypass? What are the alarms doing? Any limits that aren't, adhering to our best practices? How are my loops doing? All of these things, we basically facilitated this through remote access. And again, I will go to my postulate that the more that we can make this type of information available higher than level 2, the more secure I can be in doing remote operations. And so our belief, and we're starting to see this from more and more customers, is essentially looking for ways to take information that's currently locked from level 2 down today and making it available up higher in level 3, so I can still facilitate remote access, but put less boots on the ground, if you will, remotely from level 2 down to do our work just to manage these control systems. So, in summary, remote work has been evolving for a long time. It's been a long, slow walk, driven primarily by economic concerns and safety concerns, and it's taken place and getting better and better. But there has been an accelerating event, and that is COVID-19. And ultimately, there has been a rapid need to do so. We had to do it overnight. And ultimately, people are realizing there's some benefit here too. We're not going to go back. It's the new reality. But if we're going to do that, we better do it securely. And if we're going to do it securely, let's make sure people can do their job. Remote access is part of the solution, no question about it. But let's also try and minimize how many people have to be actually on the control network with access to the HMI and access to the engineering stations to make sure we can continue to do our work. So that is the end of my presentation. I thank everyone for your time. More information is on our website, and I'll certainly be in the hallway with any questions, and I really appreciate this opportunity.